Welcome back to the deep dive. Today we are taking a truly harrowing trip into an investigation that starts not with some dramatic discovery, but with the quiet, almost bureaucratic banality of financial trouble.
Exactly. This is the story of Anthony Todd, a husband and a father whose life was, clearly unraveling.
Right, he was facing healthcare fraud charges, and then suddenly the whole thing pivots instantly and horrifically into just an unimaginable family tragedy.
And the material we're working from today, it paints a picture built almost entirely on the perpetrator's own words, his own chillingly cold, methodical recounting of events.
And that's then balanced against the stark, the undeniable physical evidence that investigators gathered later.
Yeah.
And we have to start this deep dive with a moment that, when you look back on it, is just deeply frustrating.
Hmm.
2 weeks before the police finally arrived and made their gruesome discovery, Anthony Todd's own sister called 911. She requested a simple welfare check.
And the police responded, they went to the door, nobody answered, and, well, they left.
They just left. That failure to gain entry, that brief moment of just passing by, it becomes this permanent shadow over the whole case, doesn't it?
It really does. Because it wasn't until 2 weeks later that the FBI contacted local law enforcement about those outstanding fraud charges.
So that was the trigger.
That was the trigger. It forced the police back to the address, but this time they were armed with a warrant for his arrest. The case was, financial, a paper crime.
Until they stepped inside.
Until they stepped inside.
And that's the pivot moment, isn't it, that defines this whole tragedy. When the police finally forced their way into the unlocked home, the first thing they noticed wasn't Anthony, it wasn't the bodies.
It was the smell.
A foul, undeniable chemical odor. A smell of decomposition and just decay.
And they find Anthony Todd inside. He's disoriented. He's shaking strangely.
And he's still trying to maintain this fiction, this story that his wife, Megan, was just upstairs sleeping.
Which the officers realized instantly was not true. The narrative he was trying to build, that everything was fine, it just shattered as soon as they moved upstairs.
And what they found in the master bedroom was horrific. Anthony's wife, Megan, their 3 children, Alec, who was 13, Tyler, 11, and 4-year-old Zoe.
And the family dog, Breezy,
Yeah.
all deceased and carefully positioned.
This was not a sudden, heat-of-the-moment crime. This was calculated. And our mission today is really to unpack the intricate yet fatally flawed narrative that Anthony constructed.
The narrative to paint himself as the selfless savior who enacted a shared salvation pact.
Right, rather than the calculated executioner the evidence really reveals him to be.
That distinction, savior versus executioner, that's central to his entire confession.
He was taken to the hospital first, right? Because of all the Benadryl he'd consumed.
A massive quantity, yes. In his own failed suicide attempts, then he was brought in for questioning.
And he admitted right away that he felt very sad and very upset that he was still alive. He wanted to be on the other side with his family.
The whole conversation from that point on, it forces you to focus on this deep psychological instability, but also the premeditation that allowed this radicalized belief system to take root.
And ultimately, to lead to the murder of his entire family.
To understand the motive, you have to establish the core belief system that drove this, how the mundane reality of, financial and legal threat suddenly transformed into this apocalyptic urgency.
Right.
Anthony explained it all began pretty innocuously. Back in April, Megan, who was chronically ill, started watching videos.
Videos about what?
About the afterlife, about higher levels of consciousness, just on her Microsoft Surface laptop.
Okay, so let's unpack that initial seed. It sounds like a pretty common path for people who are suffering and looking for answers. But that rabbit hole, it seems it deepened very quickly.
Oh, it metastasized into something terrifying. The research rapidly progressed into this joint effort, focusing intensely on apocalyptic predictions and radicalized spiritual ideology.
So it became a shared obsession.
A shared obsession. Anthony explicitly stated that, by the summer, they became convinced that the world is coming to the end. Not in some distant future, but imminently.
And they developed this extreme fear that their family unit would be separated and, in his chilling words, enslaved by whatever societal collapse was coming.
Right, so the goal just shifted completely. It wasn't about managing their legal and financial disasters anymore.
No, it was about achieving what they called salvation.
This wasn't just escaping debt or the fraud charges, though that was likely the immediate stressor. It was about achieving everlasting life together.
And avoiding the pain of separation, and crucially for Megan, escaping her chronic pain and suffering. They decided they needed to transverse together or die together.
And that term transverse, it's critical to understanding their delusion. For Anthony, the act of murder became this ultimate act of physical transition. Traversing into an everlasting life, free of pain, free of sorrow. He genuinely seemed to believe he wasn't taking lives, but securing this eternal state for them.
And that reframing is how he justified the horrific acts to himself.
But the most disturbing and, frankly, manipulative aspect of this shared delusion is the alleged involvement of the children.
Yeah, this part is just horrifying. Anthony admitted they held discussions about death with them before Thanksgiving,
Asking them specifically how they would feel if mommy and daddy died.
It's an attempt to secure this kind of retrospective consent. It's just awful.
It is the fatal justification for their actions. The consistent response, according to Anthony, was, "We don't want you to die. We want to die with you."
Now, whether a 4-year-old or even an 11-year-old truly understands the finality of that statement is, well, it's highly doubtful.
Of course not. But for Anthony and Megan, this claim of collective consent provided the justification they needed. It allowed them to believe this was a shared pact, not a unilateral decision by the parents to end their children's lives.
And here's where it gets really interesting, because the narrative shifts immediately from this abstract belief and alleged consent to cold, practical research.
Into execution methods.
Exactly. And all of this was happening before Halloween. They were determined to find a peaceful death, which suggests even they initially balked at the idea of violence.
That's a key point. The methodical research reveals this conflict between their desire for a peaceful transverse and the reality of taking a human life.
Their first attempts were nonviolent.
Right, focusing on overdosing, using common over-the-counter medications. Anthony, he was a physical therapist, so he had some medical knowledge. He admitted they researched different sleep aids.
He mentions specific brand names, right?
He did. Sleep ease, Dramamine, and some generic hydro-based medications.
And the delivery method for these huge quantities of drugs.
They tried to conceal them in a pudding pie, or a Jell-O pie.
A pudding pie. The use of that familiar domestic detail wrapped up in a plan for mass murder is just so jarring.
It is. They administered these drugs multiple times over several days, just hoping the children would fall asleep and never wake up.
But those attempts, despite all the research, they failed completely. Why?
They failed because his research, though detailed, was fundamentally amateur. They were dealing with drugs meant to cause drowsiness, not necessarily immediate fatality, not in the doses they could hide in food without, alerting the kids.
He got frustrated.
So frustrated that he admitted he resorted to asking a pharmacist at a local Publix, essentially begging, "What's something good that puts you to sleep?"
Wow. That just shows the depth of their desperation and how amateur their execution really was.
And when the passive, nonviolent drug attempts failed, the research pivoted sharply.
Towards violence. That must have been a huge psychological hurdle for them to clear.
It was. Anthony admitted they recognized they were just going to have to do some sort of examination.
He corrected himself, didn't he?
He did. He quickly self-corrected that clinical term, explaining that he meant bleed to death. The failure of the drugs removed any possibility of a peaceful death and forced them to accept the reality of homicide.
So they moved from passive overdose to researching how to cause rapid, fatal blood loss. Where did they focus their research? The anatomical detail in his confession here is just unnerving.
They researched exactly where to stab for a quick, lethal bleed out, specifically targeting the umbilicus, the area above the navel.
Why there?
Because they believed that was the optimal point to hit the inferior vena cava or the abdominal aorta. The goal was rapid exsanguination, ideally combined with whatever sleep drugs might still be in the children's systems.
The detail they retained about surgical targets speaks to the intensity of their focus.
It does. But what stands out most about this research phase is the disturbing source he used to learn how to kill his family. This isn't some dark web forum or an academic journal.
No, it's a site most of us use every day.
Exactly. Anthony revealed he conducted extensive research into knife techniques and suicidal methods on a site called Quora.com.
Wait, Quora, the Q&A website.
The very same one. He described Quora as an everything website where he found detailed suggestions and feedback from other users on how to commit suicide.
That's genuinely shocking.
He said he'd click on questions like, "How do I kill myself with a knife?" and just find these detailed explanations, sometimes with diagrams, on where to strike.
So he learned how to murder his family using techniques outlined on a public website. That completely transforms passive, widely available information into a lethal blueprint.
It really does. It highlights the profound danger of this isolated, radicalized thinking meeting unlimited, unverified information. They had the motive salvation.
They had the justification, which was the children's alleged consent.
And now they had the method, researched and refined on a public forum. The only final step was establishing the timeline for execution.
We transition now into the horrific timeline of the execution itself, which Anthony recounted with just this unnerving clarity to the investigators. He confirmed the children died about 24 hours before Megan.
Emphasizing the sequential, planned nature of it all. The plan was initiated at 11:30 p.m. They set an alarm to wake up.
And the cold sequencing is undeniable. They decided Zoe, the 4-year-old, the most vulnerable, would be the first victim.
That choice, it suggests a desire to establish commitment to the pact by eliminating any possibility of turning back after what would be the most difficult act.
So Anthony walked into Zoe's room alone. She was sleeping upstairs. But he admitted that, despite all the planning, the resolve wasn't instantaneous.
And this is a critical moment for examining his psychological state. He claims he sat in Zoe's room for a staggering 2-3 hours.
2 to 3 hours, just sitting in the dark, watching his 4-year-old daughter sleep.
And he ultimately resolved that this concept of everlasting salvation for her soul was more important than her life. That time frame, it represents the psychological breaking point where the ideology finally overpowered parental instinct.
The initial method, however, it failed. He tried the stabbing, the method they had researched.
He used a small green buck knife, targeting the spot above the navel as planned. But Anthony admitted he wasn't sure if he actually punctured anything vital. He said he saw only a little mark, but not the massive bleed out they anticipated.
So this immediate physical failure, it just instantly broke the carefully planned, peaceful narrative they'd built for themselves.
Absolutely. The planned, peaceful transverse instantly became brutal suffocation.
When Zoe rolled and started squiggling, he resorted to a frantic physical method.
He put his hand over her mouth, placed a pillow over her head, and then he lay on her belly to apply pressure to keep her down until there was no motion left.
We need to just sit with that for a second. The clinical detachment required to describe the struggle of his own 4-year-old daughter is horrifying. What time frame did he give for that?
He was chillingly specific. He claimed the physical struggle, the kicking and screaming, lasted only a couple minutes, maybe 2 minutes before she faded.
And the suffocation itself.
10 to 15 minutes overall to ensure death. His ability to recount this physical struggle with such precise, detached observation, it suggests a profound psychological disconnect.
And even after the murder, Anthony maintained this twisted sense of ritualistic duty. He positioned her body, put the covers over her just to keep her warm.
And later, after moving all the bodies, he placed a rosary in her hands.
That nod back to his own Catholic upbringing, wrapped up in the act of murder, shows this terrifying synthesis of the sacred and the profane in his mind.
After Zoe, they moved to the room of their oldest son, 13-year-old Alec. The plan here was slightly different.
It involved Megan as an active participant, right, to restrain him.
Yes. Anthony claimed that Megan was supposed to hold Alec's feet down while he performed the stabbing. He described going into the room, them just eyeing each other, just gaining the confidence.
The pressure must have been immense after failing with Zoe.
He stabbed Alec in the same targeted area near the umbilicus, and Alec, being older and stronger, he reacted immediately, kicking, trying to get up.
So again, the stabbing fails is the primary method.
Right. Anthony used a pillow to cushion the back of Alec's head and then held his nose and mouth closed with his hand. This repeated method confirms the stabbing wasn't working.
But the narrative of the shared act, it breaks down here. Anthony claimed Megan left the room midway through and went back to their bedroom.
It absolutely does. That detail raises immediate, serious questions about his attempt to control the story.
He's constantly managing his image in the confession.
Constantly. Trying to maintain the Pact narrative. By claiming Megan abandoned the struggle, he takes sole responsibility for the suffocation, but he also subtly suggests a lack of total commitment from his wife. Or maybe a moment of her sanity returning.
But he doesn't say that.
No, he just said Alec's death went quickly, though he noted blood was present on the bed.
Now for Tyler, the 11-year-old, Anthony claimed Megan insisted the final child must be killed before the sun came up.
Though he didn't know why. Possibly some warped religious significance connected to darkness.
The urgency was practical too, driven by fear. Anthony described Tyler as the strongest kid and the quickest kid.
He expressed genuine concern that Tyler would get away, alert the neighbors, and just shatter their plan of transversing together. The fear of disruption was clearly more immediate than the fear of the act itself.
Tyler was sleeping downstairs in the library room, separated from the others because he was sick. Megan's role here was crucial.
She stood outside the double French doors. She was a physical guard to prevent his escape.
And Anthony repeated the stab and suffocation method for the third time.
He stabbed Tyler with the green knife, claimed he got it in right away this time, causing bleeding. But because Tyler moved, he again applied the pillow and his hand. He claimed Tyler went really, really, really quick.
The repetition shows just how chaotic and improvised the murders were after their research-based plan failed.
And here we get another profoundly jarring detail that underscores the meticulous, planned nature of their cover-up.
The mattress cover.
Yes. Anthony noted that Tyler was on a mattress with a waterproof or fluid-proof mattress cover.
And he pointed this out to the investigator almost like a point of pride, because it kept the mattress clean, minimizing the mess from the blood.
That juxtaposition is where the true horror lies for me. The idea that a father, in the middle of executing his son based on an apocalyptic delusion, is also pragmatically grateful that the waterproof mattress cover is going to minimize the cleanup.
It's a level of calculated detachment that is almost incomprehensible. They're planning a spiritual ascent but thinking clinically about housekeeping.
With all 3 children dead, the sun was indeed coming up around 5:00 a.m., fulfilling Megan's strange requirement.
As we move past the murders of the children, we have to focus on the deliberate inconsistencies in his account.
Especially concerning the deaths of the dog and his wife, Megan. These details are the cracks in his controlled narrative. They expose his attempts to manipulate the story and appear less violent than the evidence suggests.
Let's start with the family dog, Breezy. She was also a victim, included in this twisted idea of a family transverse.
Right. Anthony claimed that he and Megan decided Breezy should join them, and he said he gently suffocated the dog using Mexican blankets,
Holding her snout and nose closed. His language was, again, trying to sanitize the act. He claimed she went peacefully.
It's a textbook example of narrative control. He's trying to retain this semblance of caring, denying he knew about any violent marks on the dog.
But the detective immediately used the autopsy results to catch him in a clear, verifiable lie.
The detective revealed that the medical examiner found a stab wound on Breezy, which completely contradicted Anthony's story.
This is critical because it's a lie he didn't need to tell if his goal was just to admit to the murders. Why lie about stabbing the family pet?
It suggests he was willing to commit these gratuitous acts of violence, stabbing an animal he claimed to love, and then consciously conceal it to maintain the image of the peaceful transverse.
So if he lied about the dog's death, if he felt the need to sanitize that act, how much of the story about the children's deaths is also fabricated or softened?
Exactly. The dog's fate is this immediate, concrete warning that his confession is heavily edited for self-justification.
And the story of Megan's death is maybe the most chaotic and unbelievable part of the whole confession. It involves these repeated, failed suicide attempts that lasted for hours.
And it really contradicts the capabilities of the human body after consuming the alleged doses. After the children were dead, Megan wanted to go next.
Her plan was to consume wine and spray stuff, whatever that was, and then stab herself.
She used the smaller green knife, targeted the umbilicus, aiming for the inferior vena cava, just like they had researched on Cora.
And once again, their meticulously researched plan failed dramatically. Anthony said they lay there for 45 minutes waiting for the bleed out, but nothing happened.
All that research promised a rapid death, 1 to 10 minutes. The reality was a prolonged, painful failure.
Because of that failure, she escalated. She switched to liquid Benadryl.
Consuming 2 large family-sized bottles, based on toxicology, that dosage, especially in liquid form combined with alcohol, should have been fast-acting and incapacitating.
But Anthony claimed she survived long enough to sit up, express immense frustration, saying, "This is too long, this is ridiculous," and manually clean the wound with a t-shirt and a towel.
The fact that she was conscious and lucid enough to clean a wound after that toxic dose is a major red flag. It severely strains credulity. She should have been unconscious or severely impaired.
But she was determined. She moved on to a second, more aggressive attempt.
She stabbed herself a second time, this time specifically targeting her liver. She said she heard a little click when the knife went in.
And even after a second major injury and a massive overdose, death still didn't come quickly.
No. Anthony recalled getting up, checking on the children's bodies, performing rituals, and then returning to find her still alive and complaining. The sheer duration of her survival, it really points to Anthony manipulating the timeline to minimize his own role in her death.
This chaos culminates in that chilling final request. After hours of failed attempts and pain, Megan demanded, "I want this ended now,"
And she leveraged his twisted sense of love and duty, challenging him directly. If you love me, you can do this. I want to be with my babies.
which provided him with the emotional and moral justification he needed for the final, undeniable act of homicide against his wife.
Yes. He administered more Benadryl, waited 15 minutes to confirm she still wanted it done, and then he suffocated her with a small gray rectangular pillow.
So the long sequence of failure, the 2 stabs, the impossible Benadryl survival, and the final plea, it all serves his narrative.
It casts his final act as a mercy killing rather than the violent, forced end of a woman who is too injured and drugged to defend herself.
With the entire family dead, Anthony's fragile narrative of control and spiritual resolve just completely collapses into chaos.
He spent the next few days not in peaceful transition, but in a frantic, uncoordinated spiral of failed suicide attempts. Actions that fundamentally betray his claimed commitment to the transverse.
He was left alone in the house with the bodies for 2 weeks.
2 weeks, attempting repeatedly to follow through on the pact. His attempts were meticulously planned, but utter failures in execution. He admitted making shopping trips to CVS, Publix, and Walgreens to buy more Benadryl, alcohol, whatever else he thought might work.
He tried nearly every method imaginable over those days. He tried hanging himself with zip ties.
Admitting his neck is too big to successfully compress the carotid artery.
He tried a razor blade on his radial artery, but chickened out. He used those words, cowered it out with a knife, confirming he couldn't inflict the final wound on himself.
The methods he researched on Cora also led him to try a pellet gun. He admitted shooting himself twice, once in the liver, which bled a lot, he said, and once in the heart.
But even those attempts failed. He just ended up sleeping for 2 days straight from the Benadryl and waking up alive, sometimes in the garage in his own urine.
His life after the murders was reduced to this chaotic loop of chemical consumption and desperate, unsuccessful violence.
The admission he gave the investigator here is just huge. He explicitly conceded his resolve to die was not as strong as his religious conviction claimed. He confirmed he chickened out.
Which entirely undermines the notion that this was a unified, determined pact. The man who executed his family lacked the commitment to follow through on his own half of the spiritual bargain.
Despite his instability and failed suicide attempts, he was focused on completing the final, ritualistic stage of the plan.
Bringing the family together, an ongoing process that took days because of his periods of, chemical-induced sleep.
He meticulously detailed the logistics of moving the children's bodies, and this involves a perverse display of ultimate respect for the children he had just violently killed.
He insisted on carrying them individually, stating, "I did not want to drag him, he's my son."
The positioning was symbolic, an attempt to stage a peaceful, unified ending in the master bedroom, which contrasted so wildly with the violent reality of their deaths.
Yes. Tyler was carried upstairs from the library, placed on a mattress on the floor, on his side, with religious items, and his Team USA soccer scarf placed nearby.
A sentimental inclusion of his worldly identity.
And Alec, his mattress had to be removed first because of the blood. He was placed on a comforter, then on the bare mattress, positioned on his side, looking up toward the bed where his mother and sister were.
And Zoe and Megan were both placed in the master bed. Zoe was laid flat with her head towards Anthony's side. He even described adjusting Megan's leg that had fallen off the bed.
To make her comfortable, maintaining the illusion of domestic care amidst all that death.
And while the bodies are decomposing, he's performing these macabre rituals, using candles, performing sage smudges to allow spirits to pass on.
Yet during these same days, he was leaving the house repeatedly for Benadryl, for alcohol, and for shockingly mundane necessities. He even went to McDonald's once or twice.
That juxtaposition is the clearest window into his fractured state. He's performing these sacred spiritual rituals for cleansing and passage, while simultaneously breaking that sacred isolation to grab a McDonald's meal.
The spiritual planning and the physical reality of his hunger and his failure were in constant, brutal conflict.
And now we come to the most critical contradiction. The piece of physical evidence that utterly shatters his narrative of a swift salvation pact.
The findings of the medical examiner. This detail is so scientifically undeniable that it dismantled his entire defense strategy.
The detective presented this evidence to Anthony during the interrogation, right? He carefully acknowledged that everything Anthony had said so far about the timeline and the plan had been pretty damn consistent.
But this scientific evidence contradicted his core story about the deaths of the boys.
And what was that definitive finding?
The ME determined that the stab wounds on both Alec and Tyler were definitively post-mortem.
Meaning the injuries occurred after death.
After death. There was no blood pumping when the knives penetrated their bodies. This scientific fact directly and absolutely disproves his assertion that they were stabbed as part of the initial bleed-out plan.
That is immense. He spent hours researching how to cause fatal exsanguination, yet the physical evidence proves the stabs were ineffective and, more disturbingly, unnecessary for the death itself.
And when confronted, his initial defense was feeble. He claimed the knife went flying out when the boys jerked.
But the investigator pushed back.
He reiterated the ME's finding. The lack of blood flow meant they were already deceased, and Anthony conceded. He stated the doctors were absolutely correct that the injuries were post-mortem. He then shifted his story, implying he stabbed the already deceased boys.
The significance of that concession cannot be overstated. If the boys were already dead from suffocation, the stabbings were not for salvation. They were gratuitous acts of violence committed on already deceased bodies.
Potentially done while staging the scene, or in a panicked reaction after the suffocation succeeded where the planned stabbing failed. It fundamentally destroys the last vestige of his self-image as a loving savior executing a researched plan.
It proves the cause of death for the children was suffocation, a much more intimate and terrifyingly sustained act of violence than a quick knife stroke.
He didn't just fail to save them through the ritual, he committed unnecessary violence against their bodies after they were already gone.
The interrogation ends with Anthony revealing this devastating piece of his personal history, a tragic legacy that may have informed his decision to commit violence within his own family.
He admitted he grew up witnessing a parent kill another. He referred to his biological father simply as his sperm donor, and revealed his father had hired 2 people to shoot his mother in the middle of the night.
In Pennsylvania when he was a child. She survived, but was severely injured, still living with a bullet in her head and a false eye.
It creates this incredibly dark, tragic cycle of domestic violence. The very act that scarred him as a child extreme, planned violence within the family unit, was tragically replicated in his own crimes.
He broke into tears during the confession, stating his father still reaches out to you and harasses us. The psychological irony is just profound. He tried to become a physical therapist, a professional helper, maybe influenced by his mother's injury.
But he internalized the violence he witnessed, and it manifested decades later.
Despite this sudden outpouring of emotional context and past trauma, the detective, recognizing that Anthony might later recant, circled back to ensure the integrity of the confession.
Yes. Anthony was explicitly asked if he was under the influence of anything that would alter your mind or your thought process, and whether the medication from the hospital was affecting him.
And his confirmation was definitive.
He was firm. He confirmed he was of sound mind and knew exactly what he was saying. This testimony proved crucial when, later in court, he tried to claim his confession was coerced or medication influenced. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole.
This deep dive shows us the terrifying power of shared, isolated delusion meeting immediate financial distress. The chilling progression from research plan to chaotic, brutal execution is evident in every detail.
The sheer dedication to the meticulous planning, the core research, the anatomical targets, the waterproof mattress cover, it's all contrasted so sharply with the chaotic failure of the actual attempts, his inability to kill himself.
And the critical contradictions, like the dog's stab wound and the discovery of the post-mortem injuries on his sons. It's the story of a narrative built for self-justification that was ultimately ripped apart by the cold, impartial reality of forensic evidence.
And this tragedy is fundamentally rooted in extreme isolation. Anthony claimed that he and Megan kept their apocalyptic beliefs so private because they were constantly judged by others. Their belief system was completely unchecked by friends, family, or any kind of community intervention.
So considering the horrific result, a plan of salvation devolving into forced violence, how much responsibility does a tightly held, isolated, and utterly unchecked belief system carry when it evolves into a shared murderous delusion?
What are the implications of that kind of secrecy and radical self-justification on thought processes that become so disconnected from reality? That is something for you to consider long after this deep dive is over.